So, in talking about the whole period of time, then since World War II, there's been some big changes, and one was the border industrialization program. But even as that happened, there was still a lot of continued migration north into agriculture and other activities, increasingly services that happened. Although it was dominantly agricultural in the Pacific Northwest here, where we live. Um, and so what happens is that by the time we get, say, into the 80s, there's really large migrations. The 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act was a part of that, where they actually gave an amnesty to people here who were undocumented. And they, under a Republican president, interesting how politics have changed, and that legalized very large numbers of Mexicans. I don't have the numbers right at the tip of my fingertips here, but then it also allowed them to have family reunification where they could bring, if they were male workers, they could bring their wives and they could be reunited and have permanent resident status and their children. And so uh, during this time, then there was um, some very significant increases in migration from Mexico. And some of that also was just based on population in Mexico as well. And so what happened, we came up to 1994 and we had the North American Free Trade Agreement. And I was lucky enough to be part of one of the data groups that helped inform the US government more about Mexico's sectors. I'd been working in Mexico, and it was really, really exciting time for me at Arizona State University. Um, but I had a lot of concerns too. And one of them that had been talked about a lot would be that as we freed up trade between the two countries, reduced the tariffs basically going back and forth, that what would happen, the goal was, stated goal was to allow trade to run both directions, depending on which country was more efficient at what. Well, it was widely known that even though Mexico is a country of maize, that is the sort of national grain, and so on, that it was actually corn in the United States in the Corn Belt that had become highly mechanized, highly agrochemically intensive produce, and in fact, it enjoyed enormous taxpayer subsidies to the corn farmers. The more they produced, the more they got. What happened was then that in 1994, and actually it happened slightly before that, but it was basically anticipation of the agreement. Mexico relaxed its tariffs on corn coming south, and for the most part, it was able to enter freely into Mexico. Now, in many cases, it was a different kind of corn than Mexicans would eat themselves. A lot of times, it was yellow corn, which was considered more cattle feed, but both kinds. And it changed the whole nature of corn farming in Mexico. It drove down prices in Mexico to the point where the small producers, millions of small producers in Mexico, could not make a living anymore growing corn because the U.S. corn imports were so voluminous that they were subsidized by the U.S. government, very unfair system, frankly. And it's not hard to predict what happened. Because the Mexican corn farmers couldn't make a living, they had to go do something else. Some of them migrated to cities, but so many of the Mexican corn farmers, remember, are living in areas where they've always been Mexican corn farmer activity, for thousands of years. And so these same communities that had a long tradition of growing this corn had mass migration to the north. And in many cases, it was the same labor networks that were formed during the Bracero years of people knowing people and helping each other migrate that these people flowed along. And so these were enormous numbers of people coming in the 90s. My research in Oregon was right during that explosive period in the late 90s and early 2000s. And it was just really sort of an amazing flow. In some ways, kind of tough to manage on both ends, but it was driven partly by the cheap corn from the United States. And what also happened in Mexico was there was a mechanization that happened that was driven by this loss of corn farmers. There wasn't enough labor in many of these areas anymore to grow corn. The way corn is grown traditionally in Mexico actually requires a lot of labor, unlike the United States. And what happened instead was that many farmers, and this was certainly true in the state of Guanajuato, where much of my work happened, um, there was a switch to sorghum, or as they say in Mexico, the sorgo. And sorghum is considered cattle feed in Mexico, not for humans. And well, that's kind of true, but there actually are some cracker manufacturing plants that I've seen that I saw sorghum going into. So yeah, and my father-in-law, who's a really expert in the whole agro industry in Mexico, who I was very lucky to kind of learn from. He definitely mentored me. He worked for Del Monte, in fact, the U.S. company Del Monte, in Mexico for 25 years. So I was so lucky to have met him early in the game there. In any case, so you have this mechanization of corn at some level, but mostly it was just a switch. As a farmer who had sorghum equipment could come in and form a corn land and grow sorghum, which is kind of a similar looking plant. The grains are even sort of similar looking. And they also had the added advantage they're maybe a little more drought resistant. And so Mexico starts growing more and more cattle feed, basically for its livestock industry, so that Mexicans could have more beef. The middle class of Mexicans could have more beef. So we have this system then that changed to sorghum as well, and it drove also increase in hunger because there was less corn around grown locally, and since the Mexican people didn't want to eat sorghum but they would eat corn, the kind of subsistence sector really suffered, and Mexican children in many of these areas have been documented cases where there is nutritional shortfalls with the poorest rural kids in some of these areas. But again, this is very consistent with world systems theory because we're talking about labor falling under the influence of capital. And so labor is displaced north out of the Mexican corn farmers. And guess what? A lot of those folks ended up here, okay? And so they're started working in networks that would go through California in migrant labor, agricultural harvest, and then into Oregon into our towns, especially here in the Willamette Valley and Hood River, Rogue Valley a little bit, and some of these other areas in the south, pear farming and so on, and very much so in the state of Washington as well. So this is a huge volume of people migrating, and it wasn't just some spontaneous migration. There were networks, many of which were set up, established in the Bracero era, and then literally the farmers were pushed out into the north. What does Mexico get in return? So what they got was in some areas, and it was rarely the places where they were growing corn, by the way, as subsistence farmers for their own nutrition. It was other parts of Mexico where they grew horticultural products. So let's give you a few examples here. Wow, this is a really cool map, by the way. I actually got it from UC Davis, their Rural Migration News website, and it's actually was put together by a big importer of organic vegetables and fruits from Mexico. It's not meant to be really a comprehensive list, but it gives you an idea of the geography. This is an amazing map. Look at this. So, and some of my early work in Mexico, by the way, was in the Baja, and I remember running into strawberries and tomatoes mostly there. And you can see strawberries right there, and tomatoes, okay, various kinds. And actually, the original farms I saw were up here. But in any case, and that was, by the way, in the early 80s already, even before the trade agreement. So what happens here is that these are deserts. This is a desert area. Much of this is a desert. Even the lowlands here are close to deserts. Yet this is a huge tomato producing area. You can see there are tomatoes again there. That's the Fuerte district where I did my master's thesis work. What has happened historically in these areas, I remember driving through the Baja. This was in my kind of early surfing days, back in the early 80s. And in the winter, I would come down and I saw these camps along the road and all of these people in these camps. And I'm like, where are these people from? So I remember stopping and to get something to drink, and I remember stopping at a restaurant eating and so on. And so I started talking to some local people. Well, yeah, no sé de aquí, pues vienen de Oaxaca. And I'm like, holy cow, these people are not from here. They come from all the way down here. What the heck is going on? And I was really trying to make sense of this. Why would people be, all the way up here, and down here I saw some too, when they were from this area? And so, I kind of was puzzled by that. Um, and through the years, I gradually learned that what was going on is a lot of these growers here were U.S. financed and U.S. affiliated in this area. So U.S. capital going south, investing in winter tomatoes and other vegetables, right? And they didn't have, there was no natural population base here of people who were willing to work in farming. I mean, there's these tourist cities, in the Bajas, and those cities, the folks there, most of them are not interested in working in farm work. Most of them are urban people or small town people, but not interested in agriculture labor. They had to go to the very poorest parts of Mexico. And so Oaxaca became the big recruiting state. And here's what's interesting about this story. So it turns out that these growing districts here and in the Bajas and a little bit in Sonora, I'm told, although I haven't done so much work up there, um, when they would come up and they were literally recruited. They were given bus tickets to come up and passages over the ferries, or up around and then back south. And they lived in these kind of horrendous labor camps. I hate to say it anyway, and very, very low wages. I had trouble getting a straight answer in those days what they were making, but I could tell the way they were living. They weren't making much, um, and most of them I couldn't talk to because they were speaking indigenous languages, native languages, that not Spanish, and so it was really a challenge to kind of figure out what was happening. But here's what eventually this bunch of work done in California showed that these same growers that were growing down here, and they had business connections up in the north, the distributors and so on. They were recruited into labor networks, and they come up into California, and then they go up into Washington, Oregon, and so on after that. So the early recruitment to do kind of somewhat some U.S. finance, there's also Mexican finance growing here, by the way. It wasn't all U.S., but a big part of it was U.S. Recruiting down here, the people would come up here, and then they'd learn about the transnational migration possibilities and making 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 times more than you're making in Mexico a day. You weren't living much better in the sense that the camps weren't all that great in many cases, but the wages were better. So people would go north, and then eventually a lot of them were in the valleys of California. And in fact, I did a study. We had 25,000 students in this database. Amazing story. And the state of most rapid growth of migration from Mexico in the 90s was Oaxaca. Now, the traditional sending states, Jalisco, Michoacan, Guanajuato, which for some reason isn't on this map, but it's right here. It's just they didn't give any detail for it. These areas are still big sending areas, but Oaxaca was the biggest growth area, and it goes to those recruitments in Oaxaca during that time period. So just to emphasize then on that, that's part of world systems theory. Labor becomes uprooted, and once you've experienced the story of, migrating into, not just Northwest Mexico, but later in the United States, a lot of people stayed. Maybe they make a somewhat better life for themselves up in the north, and some would return, some wouldn't. Eventually, some of them would get documents and so on, but that's really hard to do. Um, and in fact, probably I know some of our students, in fact, are from Mixteca, some of these areas of Oaxaca where they're recruited in early years. So this is very much part of the kind of global. This is definitely an area, the periphery of labor. These are very poor. A lot of them were really subsistence producers. Not much in the way of cash crops growing there. They're very minimal. They get involved in this labor network and eventually end up in our own neighborhoods and even in our own university. How about that? So kind of amazing stories.